This video is brought to you by Laiv. Hey guys, Jay here. And this year at the Toronto Audio Fest, I attended once again at the Westin Hotel, and this is going to be the highlight video summarizing the stuff that I found interesting. We're not gonna go over everything in this video, like every room, because the chances are it's a small local show. You know, I've covered it many times. You're gonna probably see the same thing over and over again. But I wanna really talk about the gems, you know, the new stuff, the stuff that I thought was interesting, that intrigued me while I was walking around the show. So first up is going to be Songe. Yes, so the Songe is finally released, the CD at the very least. And it was a very successful kind of launch in my opinion. I thought there was a lot of interest. We were actually demoing the CD in the audio note room with the audio note gear. And it sounded pretty darn good. It was a little bit rough in the beginning, but we fine-tuned the setup. Vincent fine-tuned the setup so that it sounds much better. And a lot of feedback came back and a lot of people were very happy with how the recording turned out. Certainly, I was very happy with the recording. And for those of you that don't know, this is a recording that I helped Vincent do, and it's probably one of his best recordings to date. Like, a lot of effort has gone into this project. So this was recorded in a church, so it's a live recording, using the most top-notch microphones, like the legendary Neumann M150 microphones, for example. These are usually like $10,000 per microphone. And we used other microphones, like great microphones like the AEA ribbon mics, to add more texture and capture all the great acoustics of the church. And once again, we recorded this in Mirabel in a church just outside of Montreal, and it had just amazing acoustics. So this was recorded in that church, so it's a live recording, and you can hear all the ambience of the church and the acoustics of the church in this recording. And normally, a project like this, a recording project like this, often is limited to a certain budget. So they're not gonna go all out on the microphone or the gear for their budget, because at the end of the day, they have to make money. The producers need to make money. But we were able to do this recording without the traditional compromises thanks to you guys, those that backed Vincent's project on Kickstarter. Now the work isn't done. Vincent needs to do the vinyls, but that's going to take a little bit of time as well. And as with all good things, it takes time for these type of things to come through, especially when you're trying to do it right. And you can tell that the CD and the digital files that you can buy on the website right now is top-notch quality. And it took a bit of time, but I think it was worth it. In fact, I heard like 4 or 5, or actually way more revisions. And each time it was just getting better and better and better thanks to the mixing and mastering engineers involved. So anyways, check the recording out. It is phenomenal. The dynamics, the dynamic range is absolutely insane. You're gonna hear all the low notes from the harp and the bass. Yes, from the harp, because it's a big ass battle harp. And also the upper range, it's just a soprano. One of the best, most pure sounding vocals I've ever heard. And so top notch. And of course, Vincent's cello, enough said there. So yeah, check out the recording. Now, before we check out the next room, a message from the sponsor of today's video. This is a shaver with the world's first dual drive linear motor, reaching speeds up to 12,000 cuts per minute times 2, which is twice as fast as a regular shaver. Also, the build quality is very excellent. It's using CNC machined aerospace grade aluminum for the body that makes it not just durable, but very compact and travel friendly. As you can see here, it has airplane mode as well to prevent accidental power on. But I know what you may be asking. Jay, do you even grow facial hair? Well, I'm glad you asked. Well, in fact, I do. I grow an incredible amount of facial hair. But thanks to the Laiv P3 Pro, you'll never see me with a beard again. This shaver is equipped with a 3-blade system and a dome-shaped structure that easily shaves off all this in just minutes. And because it has an intelligent chip inside that automatically adjusts to the beard's density, there's no tugging or painful irritation. Additionally, it's also suitable for both wet and dry use, and in one full single charge using the USB-C port, it can last up to 100 minutes. And one of my personal favorite things about this shaver is how easy it is to clean. Simply remove the magnetic head, rinse it under water, and it's as good as new. And right now, Laiv is running a very special promotion for a limited time, 25% off this premium shaver. So use the link in the description to get that discount, and back to the video. Now the next room that I visited was actually the Starke Sounds new speakers, the M1 speakers with the Laiv gear. So this speaker is using a beryllium dome tweeter with a very unique waveguide and a 6.5-inch carbon woofer. It also has a reasonable sensitivity at 89 dB at 1 meter, so you could technically drive it with low-powered amplifiers in a small to medium-sized room. And I just found that the sound that was coming out of these speakers were pretty phenomenal. The high frequency was very sweet sounding and very open, very detailed, but without the, kind of the graininess, right? So it was very refined and nothing was shouting or, that sensation, the overwhelming sensation when it's like a beryllium dome tweeter and the high frequency gets a little bit, up there. I didn't get that with this speaker. So that's what surprised me was that I was listening to the speaker with the Live Harmony setup and the monoblocks, and I have this at home. This is what I'm using right now, in my setup. And I really find that the sound overall is very good. It's very inviting, a little bit warm side of neutral, but with a pairing like this, with a beryllium dome tweeter from, a very refined beryllium dome tweeter, I found that the sound was a really nice balance and there was no fatigue. The bass was full, the mid-range was full. Overall, it was a very balanced system. And for me, it was a standout in this kind of, price category because, things can be very expensive at an audio show. So the price point for the speakers here was $5,600 US for the pair, which I thought, yes, that's up there, but considering the quality of the speakers and what I heard, I thought, it sounded much better than some more expensive rooms at the show. And the live gear, enough said there. The live gear was phenomenal. I thought it sounded very good in that room with those speakers. And I thought, maybe there's a synergy going on there with these speakers and the live gear. So I was intrigued. And right next to the Starke Sound and the live room was the MonAcoustic and Burmester gear. And yes, so, I know you might be thinking, Jay, do you really have to put MonAcoustic in your show coverage? We already heard that it was your main speakers, you reviewed it, you made videos about it, you made a reference system video about it, so on. We don't need to hear about MonAcoustic again, especially the Platimon VC1 and VC2 that I reviewed basically to death. But the reason I want to cover this is because when I heard that the Platimons are going to be paired with Burmester gear, if you don't know Burmester, it's a very high-end German gear that's very respectable. And I actually covered it in my previous Toronto Audio Fest show, but that was with Burmester speakers as well. So when I heard that the Platimons were going to be paired with Burmester, I got all excited in a way because I was like, okay, well, how does it sound with some top-notch gear like that? I didn't get to hear that in my room just yet, but I was also a little bit worried because the nature of the Platimon sound tilts a little bit towards that more transparent, right? More kind of, clean, transparent, open type of sound. So, I thought maybe Burmester is a little too much, because Burmester also kind of tilts towards that range. It's very dynamic, very clean, very clear. So maybe together it may be a little bit too much and maybe I'll get fatigued. And when I walked in this room, no lie, I was so happy because the sound that I was hearing was a synergy. So I didn't know this until this show, and this is the whole point that I'm trying to make. The Platimons and the Burmester gear are top notch in terms of synergy. I would say it is probably one or two of the rooms that I thought was the best at the show. It's a very close second. Now, I'll talk about the first room that I really was mesmerized by, but I would say this was, for me, top second of the show, top two of the show. So, yeah. So for anyone interested in really top-end stuff, I thought this was just a phenomenal system and beautiful, but simple too. And it was pleasant to learn that the speakers that I own as my main speakers can scale that much. So I definitely do plan to have a Burmester piece in here to pair with those speakers because I really need to hear it in my room because that was a fantastic experience. Now, next up is the Fezz audio room. Now, I say the Fezz audio room because, it had mainly Fezz audio gear. But if you don't know Fezz audio, because I never really reviewed it on my channel, but I've had their stuff before. So they, make really nice kind of really modern aesthetic kind of tube gear. And their price point is usually not too bad. But they partnered up with a company called Lampizator to make a DAC for $3,000. And you might be asking, well, what's the big deal? $3,000 isn't like really, really cheap. It's not like $300 or $1,000. But for $3,000, why this I feel is a big deal is because it is the least expensive DAC, tube DAC that you can get with a Lampizator name on it. In fact, it was designed by the Lampizator designer. And Lampizator DACs are usually very, very expensive. They sound phenomenal, but they are very expensive. Now this, yes, it's minimal with a single 12AU7 tube, but man, the sound that I was hearing in this room, and I know, it's a show setting and stuff like that, but it's a testament to how good it can sound even at a show setting. And mind you, this was in one of those bigger rooms, so it sounded quite good, holographic, and it was, using a pair of audio vector speakers, which I love, and I thought it sounded great with the rest of the Fezz gear as well. So this room, I thought sounded amazing, and I will remember that Fezz audio speakers and DACs sound really good with audio vector speakers, because I want to review the audio vector speakers sometime soon, hopefully, because I love those speakers. And, when I review it, I will keep that in mind because especially the DAC. The DAC I want to really get my hands on because that sounded phenomenal. And a really good tube DAC these days for $3,000 is, I think, a bargain, especially with the Lampizator logo on it. And I really do have to give it to Fezz Audio. Yes, the inners may be, designed by Lampizator in collaboration with Fezz Audio, whatever. But the outer casing is very much Fezz Audio. It has that modern aesthetic, and it's neat, cute, but well-designed, both aesthetically, build quality, and sound-wise for $3,000. I think they really hit the nail on the head there for that one. Now, the only complaint I have about this DAC, and I know it's $3,000, so I can't expect a balanced output, at least a true balanced output, but I would love if for me to personally use it, in my system, I like to use balanced cables. So I would really like to see a balanced, even if it's not real balanced, option for input and output. But I heard that they are releasing the balanced version soon. Maybe it's already released, but yeah, so they're gonna have that, probably more pricey, but I'll definitely be interested in that myself. Okay, the next room is pretty crazy. This is Joseph's room, and if you know Joseph, he makes some crazy horn speakers, and this is a boutique company out of Canada in the countryside of Prince Edward County. And I actually reviewed one of their speakers before, and it was fabulous, right? And one of the things about Joseph's speakers is that, well, it's a horn speaker that's designed very well. It's perhaps one of the best designs when it comes to, horns. And, best is subjective, but the reason I say best is because of the way he designs and, tests. He tests drivers, he tests the horn, and the flare, the angle, everything to, where, if you're into the DIY community, then you know his name. He knows his stuff. And the result of that is that the horn sound is very clear. It doesn't have that, horn honkiness, kind of coloration that is bothersome to some people. Now, personally, sometimes I like that a little bit of that honky, kind of coloration from a horn. But this speaker has the projection of a horn, but it doesn't have that coloration. So if you're someone that is really bothered by the coloration of horns, but you like how the sound projects and is able to get really, really loud, really dynamic without, being wonky, right? Like most horn speakers out there. Because it is difficult to design because you have to make sure each part of the design, including the horn, works as a whole to create this frequency that isn't, crazy, right? It's not zigzagging everywhere. And that's one of the things Joseph is known for as well, is great measurements, because, he actually tests and measures. But he also emphasizes that, he uses his ears to make sure that it sounds great. And, it's a cycle, right? It's a engineering hygiene, measurement hygiene. So I really like the speakers. They look fantastic. And man, they can be pricey, but I think it's one of those situations where if you really like a horn speaker and you want to have his design, his expertise, I think it's well worth the money, considering, the quality of materials and the craftsmanship that goes into these speakers. And if you're serious about horns, I would say this is where I would personally look. I think this is probably the best true horn design in the market right now that's worth the money. Now next, I visited Tough Knot Audio. Now, if you guys see my video about Tough Knot Audio, then I'm crazy about their feet, their isolation feet that I use on my gear, my speakers. Actually, I'm using it on the Rosso Fiorentino R-40s back there right now, and it is phenomenal. Not only do my full floor love the fact that I'm not spiking it, I have million spikes. I made a joke about that in my other video where I show the spiked floors, the blood and sweat, right, that has gone into this channel for the last few years. But ever since I switched this feet, not only do my floors love it, the sound is just phenomenal, and it's immediate, right? It's not like, the difference is there, and you can hear it. The bass, the mid-range, the clarity, the refinement, the sound stage, it's very, very good. And I love the aesthetics. I love the engineering behind it. But where do these feet come from? How did they design it? Well, first of all, they're a local brand in Toronto, and that's why, they're a boutique small company. So, they're not really seen in international shows just yet, but this is a local show, so they were there, and I was happy to see them. Now, the feeds actually come from their racks and their, platforms. And these, you can see, is the feeds that's from the rack. And these racks are actually made very intentionally. I've heard Derek, who's the, owner of Tough Knot Audio, explain about the, aerodynamics and the vibration and the testings that he did. And truth be told, it just goes over right above my head because it's so technical, and he's gone through his whole booklet, very analog. He has a whole booklet that he went through during COVID, kind of cataloging all the different materials that he tested and why he's using them, comparison to this material versus that material. And you can see it in the rack. This is the inside cutout of the rack, or the platform, I should say. And you can see that it's a sandwich design of various different materials, from metal, felt, whatever's in there, to make sure that the vibration control is, as good as it can be. And I actually tested this, and you can see on the graph right here how well it isolates. It is amazing. And I've used a lot of platforms before, including, Townsend, seismic vibration stations, butcher blocks. And yes, butcher blocks are better than nothing, by the way. But I've tried and tested various different platforms in my journey. And these are the, platforms that I swear by. Yes, they can be a little bit pricey, but so are really high-end platforms. But this one really works, and it is worth the money because it is tested and tried. And yes, you're supporting a boutique local brand. It's really just, the husband and the wife. But the thing is that the amount of R&D work that went into this, I think it's a bargain. And I really think even a bigger company with the economy of scale, if they were to put this much R&D and time into designing a platform that works this well, I think it'll be more expensive than what they're offering. I think they're offering this price because they know, what the material cost is, and they're just trying to, make sure that the price isn't too crazy because they're a new brand. But anyways, I think it's a very much worth the price. And I'm using it myself for my turntable. And I do plan on using it for the rest of stuff like my amplifier and my CD player back there very soon. They have different tiers, GP1, GP2, GP3. I have GP3 for my turntable because I'm a badass. but I will have GP1 and GP2 for other smaller components perhaps in the future. Now, the next room I visited was the Gershman's room. Now, another local brand here in Toronto, downtown actually. And I actually visited them a while back. I did a, factory tour, facility tour video, and they have a beautiful listening room. They have a beautiful studio attached to the listening room that's using their speakers. You know this brand. This brand has really shaked up, my perception of high-end audio in the beginning stages of this channel, more or less. And I really like the design. Now, they came up with this new model, and it is a very expensive loudspeaker. It is their new flagship speakers that surpasses the, avant-garde. And it's called the Symphoria. And as you can see, they kind of went full on, no cost, no object on the speaker, essentially. As you can see, it's using their own proprietary drivers, according to them. Very unique looking drivers. I mean, the drivers were really mind-boggling. It kind of drew me into the speakers. And of course, the overall cabinet design is very unique as well. And they actually had like an empty cabinet showing the internals of the cabinet. And they had, isoacoustic feet or some kind of isolation material sandwiched between the top, mid-range, and high-frequency housing, cabinet that, sits on top. So it's like, the design-wise, I thought it was a very interesting, unique design, and the grill also was very interesting. I thought the grill was very beautiful. Now, of course, these are solid kind of, wood pieces, so you would ideally take them off when you're listening. But, I thought the look of the grills was fantastic. And actually, I think I would personally prefer to have them on all the time because of how it looks. But technically, you should take them off for playback. And I just thought the overall sound that I was hearing in this room, I thought was excellent. Now, I do think that this speaker particularly brings something to the table that I haven't really heard from Gershman speakers before. And it was that sense of a little bit more naturalness and dynamics and that openness, Gershman speakers had great bass and dynamics to begin with. Even their studio, monitors were just fantastic. And I remember reviewing it way back as this speaker that's really great if you are very sensitive to high frequency, because this speaker was very much on the dark side, very warm side. So it was very inviting. If you play rock and really, metal and stuff like that, and you don't want any fatigue, this was a great speaker for that. In fact, I talk about a story way back when a client came into the store that I was used to work at, and he was looking for a speaker with literally basically no high frequency, shrillness. No little bit was bothering him. He had very high sensitivity. He's actually still to this day probably the only individual I found, to really hate any type of high frequency or airiness or detail. He didn't find any of that important. And I remember, kind of pointing towards the studios for him. We didn't carry the speakers at the time, but he really didn't like anything in the stores. Even Sonos Faber was too bright for him. So I pointed towards the Gershmans, and ever since, I think he bought the studios, and he was very happy. So the point is, most Gershman speakers I've heard was very good in the bass. I mean, the bass was phenomenal. On a subwoofer territory, you do not need a subwoofer with these speakers. And that can be said the same thing for this flagship speakers, the Symphoria. But the difference was the mid-range and high frequency was much more refined, at least from what I heard in a short amount of time in a show setting. So take it with a grain of salt. But I thought it was, the best sound I've heard from Gershman. And just below one floor down from the Gershmans was the headphone section, the Earvana. And this is like a, HiFi, kind of setup for the Toronto Audio Fest that, started, I think, last year. And it's very successful. I really like it. I think the addition of headphones, headphones and headgear, personal audio is excellent addition for the show. And I say that because, I really liked what I saw. First of all, Neil was there, and he was, showcasing all his great headphone stands. And if you don't know him, he designs all this in his shop near the Niagara region. And yes, that's where the Niagara Falls is, the famous, Niagara Falls, but, somewhere there, right? Nearby, because it's the Niagara region. So I don't know exactly how far, but near there. So anyways, so it's also a Canadian brand. And he makes some fabulous looking headphone stands that actually is crafted. It's a boutique company once again, and I love this about Canada. It's a lot of boutique companies that put in very hard work and good intentions behind their design. Now, the other thing is that, they also design for Geshelli, the hardwood cases, and they're just beautiful, beautiful. I mean, you would think that these are CNC machined, but they are all made in his shop, one by one, which is quite amazing. And I don't know about you, but personally for me, I have this kind of fetish, fetish is a strong word, but preference for these beautiful wood finishes. Something about wood, beautiful wood makes me feel a certain way. So if that's you, I think their headphone stands and the Geshelli DAX with the outer casing is one of the best craftsmanship I've seen on wood. He really knows his way to crafting things with wood, and I just thought it was fantastic. And I love the fact that he experiments and uses different types of wood. So that creates a unique type of look. And it made me think, I couldn't choose which one was my favorite. Every piece of wood had its own kind of charm. So I really, really liked it. Oh, and get this, I didn't mention this, but the brand name is actually AngryGoose. And I actually asked him why his brand was, AngryGoose. Why not Happy Goose? And he told me it's because his wife, calls him the Angry Goose. So I just thought that was funny. It's kind of like a lot of these hi-fi boutique brands, even like Shit Audio, right? Came from his wife basically saying, "What's all this shit?" And he said, "Okay, that's gonna be my company name, Shit Audio." So I find the stories there pretty fascinating. Now, of course, while I was at Earvana, I got to try some headphones, and I'm not gonna go over every headphone I tried because I was there for quite a bit of time with my friends trying different headphones. But I will say the new Hifiman headphones were absolutely freaking amazing for the money. I was guessing, because I wasn't familiar with these models just yet, I was guessing how much these would be with my friends, and then we finally asked for the price, and I was flabbergasted because the price was very inexpensive for what I would consider almost a flagship experience with these kind of headphones. In fact, both of my friends, I didn't buy it yet, but both of my friends bought one of these headphones or both, and they're very, very satisfied. They've actually been posting on Facebook, a headphone group about their purchase and how happy they are. And these are guys that own a lot of headphones, have owned a lot of headphones. And you might remember Tujin. He used to work here in my YouTube channel. So I just thought the Hifiman headphones, they were always a good value, but I think it's becoming even better value as of recently. Now, I visited 2 more rooms that I thought was fascinating. Now, this room, to me, was the best sound of the show. And it really is no surprise, it's by Mark. Audio by Mark Jones is a dealership actually about 20 minutes away from where I'm located. And they are, he's a small dealership, but high-end dealership. And one thing that I really appreciate about Mark is that whether it's the Montreal show or the Toronto show, every time I visit his room, I learn something. I feel like he's a very experienced dealer, right? An audiophile. And I think he is, very relaxed, for the lack of better words, chill, right? As youngsters like me like to say. He's an easygoing guy. He's not going to bust your balls trying to make a sale. And I love the fact that you can really tell this guy, this gentleman, right, really enjoys the hobby, the passion itself, as opposed to just trying to sell. Because when you go to his room, you can understand the synergy that he was going for. You can understand the setup, the time it took, and the trials that he went through. And in fact, he's famous for like tweaking the system throughout the show sometimes to fine tune the sound. And so it's always best to go to his room towards the end. And so that's kind of what I learned. And it's always so busy in his room because of how great it sounds. So for me, I like to visit on the last day of the show. Not that you should, but I personally learned that. And the interesting thing is that depending on, what kind of things he's showing, it's always interesting, right? Last time he showed me Magical with CH Precision, and I just thought, I never thought I would hear Magical speakers sound like that. It was a fabulous match, and the setup was really amazing. It teaches you that it's always about setup first and synergy more than, just throwing expensive gear together and hope that it sounds good. So, and I think he's kind of like, figured out synergies that work in his shop, and then he brings that, synergy to the show. So I want to visit his dealership, because I feel like that might be a better representation of the true kind of skill set, Mark has. But this time around, he was showing Martin speakers, which you guys know I love, with Luxman gear. And actually, I've never heard Martin speakers with Luxman gear. And I learned once again, that seems to be a really good synergy. And this room just sounded fantastic. I mean, the dynamics, the overall clarity, the explosion. The thing is, whether he had the Magical setup before in Montreal and Toronto or the Martin setup this time around, they all sounded great. They all had a similar type of thing that I think Mark was trying to go for, which is that dynamics, that clarity, that nice balance, right? So nothing is, overshadowing the other, right? High frequency isn't overshadowing the mids. The mids are not overshadowing the bass, and so on and so forth. So there's a nice balance, but it was very refined, and you could tell this was a high-end setup that was very well catered. And I think that's key, and that's why I would say I highly recommend Mark if you're a Canadian and you're looking for, a good high-end setup, and you want to make sure that your dollars count towards a high-end setup, right? Because it's not all about putting in money. I think Mark is the guy to go to because I can tell that he has experience, and the sound of his room is always excellent, even at a show setting. So enough said. Best of the show was for me, again, the Mark's room. Now, last but not the least, I visited Angela-Gilbert Yeung's room. And again, it's another local brand here in Canada. And they had some crazy designs. And this is the hallmark of the designer. This individual really loves to design things with creativity. And I think that's what's so amazing about the design choices here. So they have the Angela-Gilbert Yeung's, amplifier, the normal looking ones, but they're also, I think, aesthetically pleasing as well. And they sounded great. What I find is that it's a very refined and natural sounding gear and system. They did have it with a very expensive Think Team speakers that I'm not too familiar with. But overall, the sound was fantastic. And I'm very familiar with Angela-Gilbert Yeung's products, actually, because he used to run a company called Blue Circle a while back, and I was a customer. Especially, I learned about the thingy from a client, and this was a very high-end client. It was actually one of my first installations that I went to. So I walked in his room. He had Wilson Audios, Macintosh, all PS Audio, all these gear. And he said, if I have to keep one thing, it would be this thingy. And I looked at it. I was like, that looks like, a silicon molded, thingy, right? What is it? And he was like, it's power filtration. And I swear by this. This makes my system sound so much better. So the next day, as I usually was spontaneous, right? Spontaneous Jay went out and bought a few of those. And I remember thinking to myself, man, these things work. These things sound great. And ever since then, I've had their, tube DAC, preamplifier, blue circle stuff. But long story short, the overall sound is always very refined, very refined from the capacitor, filtration. And he did very interesting experiments, I think the last show or the 2 shows ago, where he kind of like put filtration on the go and kept adding filtration to see where the, diminishing return hits. And it never did, by the way. That was the conclusion. He kept adding and it kept sounding more refined, bigger sound stage, better imagery, and it was a very interesting demo. But all said and done, they have incredibly interesting designs. And mind you, the heels, those are heels, are actually functional amplifiers. So get that. I think it's just fantastic. I'm not even sure if they actually sell the heel model, but nevertheless, I just thought it was a very interesting design. And I actually have a Patreon and a great friend of mine that swears by his stuff. He loves Angela-Gilbert Yeung's designs. And I can see why. Because I used to as well. I still do. But, I think it's just amazing the creativity that goes beyond just the sound aspect. So yeah, that's pretty much it from me. I hope this video, summary video, highlight video of the Toronto Audio Fest was enjoyable. And if it was, please click that like button. It helps my channel out greatly and it doesn't cost you anything. And I really greatly appreciate your support. So make sure to subscribe for my next video and I'll see you guys on my future videos. Until next time.